In this lesson, we're going to be discussing basic and dynamic disk, MBR and GPT partitions, and REFS resilient file system. We're going to start by talking about basic disk. Now, Server 2012 supports two types of disk. You have your basic disk and your dynamic disk. When you buy a disk and you put the disk in your computer, you install that disk. That disk is usually installed as a basic disk. And this is the type of disk most often used with your Windows operating system. The term basic simply means that the disk contains a basic volume. Basic volume meaning that you have primary partitions and logical drives. To access disk management and actually see the disks that are installed in your computer, from Server Manager dashboard, you want to go to Tools and Computer Management. Once you click on Computer Management, you're going to be presented with the Computer Management screen. Here, you want to click on Disk Management to open the Disk Management section. And we can see here that Disk Management actually shows us the disks that are installed. You have here disk 0, and you can see it's a basic disk and it's online. You have primary partitions. Here you have 3 primary partitions and 1 extended. A basic disk can have 3 primary partitions and 1 extended, or it can have up to 4 primary partitions. You can see here that we have disk 0, and in order to convert a basic disk to dynamic, what you can do is to right click on the disk, in our case here disk 0, and you will see the command convert to dynamic. You might want for some reason to convert your basic disk to dynamic. The way to do it is to right click on the disk and click on convert to dynamic. When you convert your disk from basic to dynamic, no data is lost, so you're good to go. Once you right click and say convert to dynamic, you're going to get the box, and the box will let you make sure that this is the disk that you want. If you have more than one disk here and you decide that you want to convert 2 or 3 disks to dynamic, just make sure that the tick is by that disk, and here you can go ahead and say OK. And usually you will probably get a prompt asking you if you're sure you want to convert your disk from basic to dynamic, and you will say yes or you will say no. On a basic disk, or if you have a basic disk installed in your system, these are the actions that can be performed using that basic disk. You can format the partitions on that disk. You can mark partitions as active. You can delete and create primary partitions and extended partitions. For example, I have a disk and I have one partition, which is the C drive. What I might want to do is to divide that partition into C, D, and E, 3 separate partitions. Remember that with a basic disk, you can have 3 primary and 1 extended, or you can have 4 primary. You're able, using the basic disk, to create and delete any logical drive. And again, like we saw just now, we can convert the basic disk to the dynamic disk. Let's turn our attention to dynamic disk. And let's look at the difference between the basic and the dynamic disk. Now, we said that with the basic disk, you're going to have partitions. With the dynamic disk, you are going to be creating what we call volumes. And our volumes are going to be able to span multiple disks. You have different types of volumes. You have span volumes, you have stripe volumes, and you can also create fault-tolerant volumes such as a mirror volume or a RAID 5 volume. Compared to basic disk, dynamic disk offers greater flexibility. Now, the same way, here you right-click on the basic disk and you say convert to dynamic, which will actually give you the dynamic disk. Let's talk about the different volumes on the dynamic disk. Now, the difference here is if the disk is a dynamic disk, we're going to be able to use that span volume that we talked about. We're going to be able to use the striped volume, but we can only use those types of volumes if we decide to convert the basic disk to the dynamic disk. Here we have an example of a simple volume. A simple volume can consist of a single region on a disk. So when I right-click on the disk, I will have a selection of whether I want to do a simple volume, a span volume, or a stripe volume. A simple volume is going to give you one space on a disk. That can take up the whole disk, or you could decide to use half of the disk or some of the disk size for that simple volume. But it is going to be space from a single dynamic disk. Next, we want to look at the spanned volume. Now here we have more than one dynamic disk. As a matter of fact, we have 4 of them. Remember, in order to get the span volume, the disk must first have to be converted to dynamic. We can't have the span volume using the basic disk. Let's see how data works with the spanned volume. With the span volume, you have your data being stored on the first disk. When that disk is full, then data is going to be stored on the second disk. When the second disk is full, then data is going to be written to the third disk. When the third disk is full, data is going to be written to the fourth disk. And for the user, even though I have 4 separate disks here, the drive, the span volume drive, will appear to the user as one drive. The user will not see 4 separate drives. If it's the D drive, the user will simply see D drive. You notice here that when you're creating a span volume, your disk don't have to be the same size. They can be different sizes. Let's take a look at the striped volume. Data is written a bit differently on the striped volume. Here we have 3 disks, and let's say this is a block of data here. Your data is going to be striped across all of the disks at the same time. So if I have a block of data, I have a file, for example, one section or one cluster is going to be stored on disk. The next section of that file is going to be stored on the second disk, and the next section is going to be stored on the third disk. So you have data striped across the disk. One difference between the striped disk and the span disk is that the striped disk will give you a better read-write performance than the span drive because you can write to multiple drives at the same time and you can read from multiple drives at the same time. But there's a catch. Because the data is striped across the disk, if I were to lose one of these disks, if one of these disks went bad, I am going to lose all of my data. Example being, if I'm saving a file and the different parts of the file are on different disks, if one disk goes down, I lose that whole file. So the stripe drive or disk is very fault intolerant. With this span, when we save on one disk and that disk is full, the data moves on to the next disk, or the rest of the data goes on to the next disk, and so on and so on. But with the span, if one of those disks fail, then only the data that is on that disk, that one disk that failed, only that data will not be readable. Because what I could do is to break the span set, and then I'd be able to access the other disk in the span volume. So you have some kind of tolerance there. But for this stripe, once one of these disks go bad, you're going to lose your data. Nothing is going to be available to you at all. Next, we want to look at disk partitions. If you are using a Windows operating system, Windows uses two types of partition tables. One is called a master boot record, MBR, and the next one is GPT. Now, once you buy a disk and you install the disk in your computer, that disk is not initialized. You have to initialize that disk so that the partitions can be able to be made on that disk. So if you go to the disk section in computer management, what you can do is to right click on the disk. If you see this disk here, it says there's a little red arrow and it says unknown, not initialized. Right. All you have to do is to right click on the disk and say initialize disk. Once you do that, then you're going to be able to choose the partition style that you want to use. Now, MBR, Master Boot Record, that partition was with us from way back. So MBR works with previous versions or previous operating systems or previous client machines. Be careful here, because if you use GPT when you're setting up your disk and you want to install a previous version of Windows, then the GPT partition style is not going to be recognized by those previous versions. Another difference between the MBR and the GPT is that you could use the MBR if your disk is less than 2 terabytes or 2 terabytes. But if your disk is larger than 2 terabytes, or your disk is going to be used on a titanium-based computer, you want to use the GPT as your partition style for your disk. Let's look again at the main differences between the MBR partition and the GPT. We had said before that MBR can be used with previous operating systems. MBR can handle only 4 primary partitions and a 2 terabyte of hard drive space. So up to 2. Over 2, you can't use MBR. Now, if you're going to choose GPT, you don't have those limitations at all. There's no limit to partitions or storage outside of what the drive itself can handle, outside of the capacity of the drive. Versions of Windows earlier than 8 can't boot with the GPT drive. It means, again, that those previous versions, you have to use MBR on the primary or boot hard drives for that operating system. Now, you ask yourself, well, how do I know if my hard drive is using GPT or MBR? Simple. At your command prompt or your PowerShell prompt, you simply type disk part. Once you type this part, you're going to see the disk part prompt come up, and you type list disk. What that's going to do is going to list all the disks that you have. You see I have here this 0 and this 1. It means I have 2 disks and they're online. Now, if GPT is enabled on any of the disks, what you will see here is under the GPT column, you're going to have a mark for each drive where GPT is enabled. As you see here, none of my disks have GPT enabled. So if you're curious and you want to find out what your hard drive is using, remember you can use at the command line at the PowerShell prompt this part and list disk. The last thing here we want to address is what we call resilient file system, RES. REFS. Now, most of us are familiar with NTFS because when we're formatting our drive, that is the drive system that we use, NTFS. First, we had FAT, which is the FAT system. Then we had NTFS. Now Microsoft in 2012, and this is new because this came out for Server 2012, Microsoft has a new file system. And I guess the intent was that this file system would become the next generation after NTFS. But there are some challenges to REFS. Let's look at the advantages first. REFS will allow you to do integrity checking and data scrubbing. You don't have to run check disk on your system if there's a problem, or if you want to repair a problem on your system. You don't have to run check disk. We used to do that in Windows XP and previous operating system versions. REFS file system can protect against data degradation. And also, REFS claims to be able to handle hard disk failures. Now, like I said, there's some challenges. If you format your disk using the REFS file system, then you can't boot Windows from that volume. Another thing is that if you have that REFS volume, you can't do disk quotas, you can't do encryptions, you can't do file level compressions, and all of those things you can do with NTFS. Can't do them with FAT, but you could do them with NTFS. But there's still some advantages. And let me tell you, one of the places that you would want to use REFS would be if you are dealing with storage spaces or storage pools and that type of thing, where you have large storage areas that are high speed and can handle large data networks. So it has its advantages, but it has its drawbacks. Its self-healing power is one of the advantages. That's what we say. It's the ability to repair the files without downtime. The REF also boasts about the ability to make sure that if there's a power failure, you don't have the loss of data. And also, another advantage, I guess, is that we have now the ability to create huge volumes and files and give file names that are longer than 255 characters. And we weren't able to do that before. So you want to think long and hard about using this REFS file system when you're formatting your disk. And remember what I said. It is mainly used for storage area networks or storage spaces where you have large sets of data to deal with. Now, that is the end of this session. Thank you for listening.